and I will talk more about what the W. Haywood Burns Institute is and sort of how we came to build this interaction or this relationship with Pima County, and Doyle reaching out to us a little bit later. But for now, I will first welcome you all and thank you all for being here with us for this training series that I hope becomes a series of dialogues. Particularly, I think as we move forward, we'll be looking to engage and interact with you all and your questions and your comments and so on and so forth. So please do feel free to jump in. If you want to do it in the chat, if you want to, turn on your screen, if you want to come off mute because you have something to say. I think these things always work better when they are interactive. But before we jump into all of that, I'll just start with a little bit about myself. So for some of you who have been on for a while, you probably heard me say some things, but the overview is I was born and raised in a little town called Vicksburg, Mississippi. And after doing college in Mississippi, went to law school at Tulane in New Orleans, worked in foster care advocacy for a couple of years in New Orleans, but after law school, that is, worked in foster care advocacy. But before all of that, when I was in law school, I was doing a lot of advocacy work specifically for school to prison pipeline. And what that would look like in New Orleans was most of the schools there are charter schools, and that can come with lesser accountability measures and procedures for parents and so on and so forth and community members, particularly when it comes to school discipline. And so there were a lot of Black and brown youth sort of getting pushed out of schools for, relatively minor infractions and getting suspended and expelled. We know that increases the likelihood that young people end up in the system, and we don't want that. So representing those young people in mandatory disciplinary hearings was something that I did on a voluntary basis while I was in law school. And through that work, connected with folks who would go on to precede me at the Burns Institute. And ultimately, because of those connections, because of that work, because of just the level of advocacy around racial equity, just had an opportunity to join the team. And so I've been with the Burns Institute for about 4 years now doing that work. I went to law school wanting to be a public defender, and then realized that I wasn't going to be arguing very much, but that I would be sort of taking the best deals a lot and sort of explaining to clients why it was in their best interest to do that, and decided I really wanted to have access to or the capacity to create more sweeping change, right, than person by person trying to sort of walk people through a process that is in many senses rigged against so many. So that's a little bit about me. If there are no questions, again, I will jump into the training session for today, which is an introduction to structural well-being. Structural well-being is an approach that was developed by our founder and president at the W. Haywood Burns Institute. His name is James Bell. He's retiring at the end of this year. But he really, I think, in response to structural racism, wanted to create a framework from which systems could create opportunities for people to thrive rather than to react to incidents of harm when they occur, and to do so in the most punitive ways possible. So that's a little bit of what we will talk about today. I'm going to share the screen, and before we get directly into the approach, we'll do a little sort of level setting, particularly around shared language, just going through some definitions and some concepts to make sure that we're all on the same page about what it is we're talking about. So we'll do that first, and then we'll get into the actual approach. And let's see. Yeah, so this is the intro slide. That's an old picture of what I used to look like before there was a pandemic, and now I don't quite trust barbershops. At some point, I will get my hair cut again, but bear with me for the time being. So, W. Haywood Burns Institute is a Black-led national nonprofit based in Oakland with a diverse team of visionaries working to transform the administration of justice and challenge racial hierarchy and social control within public systems, right? The picture that you see right here is W. Haywood Burns himself, who was a human rights activist, attorney, and educator, including being a law school professor and dean. He was a friend to and mentor to our founder and president, James Bell, whose picture you'll see a little bit later. And he, in his career, represented people ranging from folks within the Black Panther Party to people who had been incarcerated in Attica prison during the Attica prison riots. So just really, significant impacts in terms of human rights and civil rights here in this country, as well as around the world. And he died tragically in a car accident while attending a conference in South Africa, I think in the early or mid 90s it was. So we like to honor his legacy with this picture and just talking a little bit about his life when we have presentations or the opportunity to do it in spaces like this. The organization was named for him because the founder, again, James Bell, was so moved by the life of his mentor that when he wanted to sort of begin this work, he wanted to honor Haywood by naming the organization for him. So a little bit more about what we do or how we do it. We have been around for over 20 years now in over 200 jurisdictions throughout the country, working in a number of ways to try to impact that systemic level change. And so that looks like policy, advocacy, and data. So what do the numbers tell us about who's coming into our systems and what changes we might need to make? What do those numbers tell us about, what laws or policy changes are necessary to make the types of impact that we can be proud of? Place-based work, which is working with a lot of system stakeholders as well as community members and various other folks within human services sectors to build those new avenues, those new approaches, those new policy and practice changes that lend themselves again to that impact. The Credible Messengers Network, right, which many of you may be familiar with, which is essentially a network of people who are formerly incarcerated, who have navigated probation, helping people who are currently engaging with those systems to do it successfully, and being compensated for it, right? Treating them as the experts, the subject matter experts that they are when it comes to experiencing these systems, and valuing that at the level that it deserves, right? We believe that the people who are closest to the issues and problems with our systems are the people who are closest to the solutions, and that we have to center them to find those solutions. And that leaves the Community Justice Network for Youth, sort of the organizing arm of the organization, working with various community-based organizations, advocacy groups, and coalitions throughout the country to work toward those structural changes and to help to create accountability to community members from system stakeholders. So that is what we sort of do at an overview level. We are also a strategic partner with the Safety and Justice Challenge within the MacArthur Foundation, and will be one of the TA providers, not just within the initiative as a whole, but also specifically with the racial equity cohort as it takes shape and moves forward. So desired results for this particular session are sharing the framework, the underlying theory, and the developing practice of structural well-being, understanding the difference between harm reduction and transformation. Both have their places, but some of those are more disruptive and impactful changes, and some of them are more incremental and a little bit closer to the status quo, as well as sharing insight to how to begin harm reduction work with an eye toward transforming the local justice system, if that's the route folks choose to go. So next, getting into sort of the core concepts and terms here. We start with the 4 levels of racism: personal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. Personal being private beliefs, prejudices about people of color, right? Or race-based sort of ideations and thoughts and concepts about who people are, what they can do based on the color of their skin. That interpersonal racism would be the expression of that personal or private belief or prejudice between folks, right? That's when you actually begin to experience it or feel it. Institutional being folks who might have or harbor those personal or interpersonal thoughts and expressions, being in a position within an institution to bring the force of an institution behind that type of thought, right? So discriminatory treatment, policies, practices within organizations and institutions, right? If you're a gatekeeper within an institution with a certain level of bias, those biases are going to show themselves within the organization. Could be in terms of who gets hired and who does not, who gets promoted and who does not, whose needs are met and who's taken seriously and who's not. And then structural racism essentially is the next step, and I realize I'm not even in slide presenter mode. So here we go, is the system, right? In which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations work to perpetuate racial inequity. So essentially, structural racism builds on or is the culmination of all of these 3 at work, right? Institutional is the culmination of interpersonal and personal at work. Interpersonal is the culmination of personal at work on someone else, right? They all sort of build on each other. And that's sort of the point of talking about these 4 levels. All right, so now some core concepts, particularly equality and equity, which we will really dive into in just a few minutes. But equality, the basics of equality being referring to the state of being equal, especially in status, rights, and opportunities. Equity, meaning you reach a state where there's an inability to predict outcomes by race and ethnicity. That's one definition. The definition that I really like to use, we will get into a few slides down. But also intersectionality, right, is important, right? So recognizing, again, so we talked about with the 4 levels of racism, how they build on each other, and recognizing the ways that identity builds on, different facets of identity build on each other, or at least the reactions, the structures, the levels of oppression that people experience based on the various aspects of their identity. Those things are all sort of built on each other in such a way that they can compact the level of issues that a person may experience, right? So essentially, it's one thing to be, a cisgender heterosexual Black man, and it's a different level of oppression potentially to be a queer Black man, right? Or, an even different level if one is, a queer Black woman, right? There are various forms of stratification, right? that don't exist separately, but are woven together in terms of creating people's experience. Important to point that out while we're talking about, as Doyle lifted before, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay. All right, so here are sort of the ways that I particularly like to think about equity and equality. I think equality tends to focus on the equal treatment of each person, right? So in an interpersonal context, in a one-to-one context, this is exactly what we want, right? Like, we want people to treat us like they treat everyone else. And, when they don't, we notice it or we recognize it. Now, what's interesting, and I think, and we'll talk about this, in a later slide in more detail, but what's interesting is, I think it would be controversial to say, but I'm going to say it, we actually don't want systems, right, to treat everyone the same. That may be something that people are not used to hearing or confronting. But equity, right, focuses on responding to the needs of individuals and or communities. Those needs are going to be different based on that individual or that community, right? And so if you treat everyone the exact same, as opposed to responding directly to the needs that people have, you're going to leave some folks out, or you're going to leave some people without the proper or appropriate or same level of responsiveness, the same level of solution, the same level of wholeness, right, that you will have achieved for others, right? And that's why it's important in a systemic context to respond directly to needs more so than to try to treat everyone exactly the same. An example of that could be, I think a relatively recent example was the giving out of like masks and COVID tests, right, by the federal government, right? Usually, I think the number that each household would get was 4, right? Well, some people have more than 4 people in their households. This does not really adequately provide for them. And then there are some who have, like myself, only 1 person in my household. So if I have 4, then I have some extras that gives me a little bit more flexibility in terms of making sure that I have a mask when I need it, or I have a test when I need it, versus those who have 5 or 6 people. And now we've got to figure out how we're going to manage the masks or tests among us all, right? So that's the difference between equity and equality. Put another way, I mean, it looks like this, and I'm sure you guys have seen something like this before, right? So if children are trying to see a baseball game over a fence, and they all get, even though they're different sizes, they all get the same level of boost, then you're still going to end up with something that's unequal. Versus if you respond directly to what each person needs, right? The response may look different, but the end result is going to be the same, right? People are going to end up in the same place, not because you did the same thing, but because you looked at specifically what folks needed to all be made whole and to all be brought to the same level in terms of what the solution would be for the issue presenting itself within communities and with individuals, right? So that's a visual representation of equity versus equality, right? No one's above anyone here, although some people have more boost or more resources provided to them to get to the same place. Whereas here, everybody gets the same thing, and there's some very unequal results. And so for me, I like to segue this directly into talking about the curb cut effect, because I know some people see visualizations like the one on the last slide, and they say, or maybe are, given pause by the fact that you're talking about doing different things for different people, right? A lot of us are conditioned on, again, that equality piece, right? And so we want to see everyone treated the exact same way, and we think that's the only proper or appropriate way to respond to the issues that confront, our communities when we're talking about human services systems. And what I would say to you is a good example of the power of equity is the curb cut effect, which stands for making something better for people who are excluded or marginalized can make it better for everyone, right? So if you think about literally the curb cut, meaning the small ramps that are provided on most street corners in order to provide access to the curb, those were meant for people with disabilities. But it's not that, if you are an able-bodied person, you don't have access to it. It's meant simply to provide equal or even or equitable access to those who otherwise would not be able to access the curb. So, it's a weird sort of example, but any person, right, if you're pushing a stroller or your knees are bothering you today, right, or you're carrying luggage, right, the curb is easier for you to manage because we did something about accessing it that responded directly to the needs of people with disabilities, right? So that is what being equitable in our approaches and responses allows us to do. So yeah, you might be doing something, responding specifically to certain needs or making something better for people who are marginalized, but that rising tide, if designed properly, in terms of its approach or in terms of the approach that would present the rising tide, will actually lift all boats, right? Will actually be meaningful in its impact to everyone while responding directly to the needs of those folks who've been left out. And that's the power of, equitable approaches, and that's the potential that they have when done well. So a couple of other concepts here: othering versus belonging, generalized set of common processes denying full humanity based on a person being seen as less than or a threat to a favored group, right? That's what we call othering. And so making people feel less than, making them feel like they don't belong, right? That process or that concept, right, is othering. And what it does is it leaves people out. It does not respond to the things that they need. It does not acknowledge that there's a need. And so it marginalizes people, particularly when it happens at a systemic or an institutional level. And next is discriminatory design. We use this particular picture because we want to make clear that while it sounds like we're talking about a lot of nebulous sort of concepts, these things do actually impact the physical world in certain ways, right? Things that we actually see happening in our communities are impacted by concepts like discriminatory design, right? So this is a Southern Parkway bridge in the New York City area that was built by a bureaucrat who was said to have built the coverage, or I'm sorry, the underpass very low underneath this bridge in order to keep out people of color who would be traveling to, say, Jones Beach or other places like that in the New York area by bus. And so actually, I think it's a former coworker who has, come out and made clear that that was at least the stated goal with building the bridge in this way, is that this could keep out buses and keep out public transportation from people who are Black or brown or otherwise considered to be poor or of lesser means, and according to this individual, lesser deserving, right, of being in some of the more beautiful or luxurious or leisurely places in the state or in the area, right? So that's sort of what that slide is there to illustrate for you is what discriminatory design literally can look like and how it contributes to how that sort of decision making contributes to the various disparities that we see throughout systems all over the country. And white supremacy culture, right? So I know that you guys did not show up on a Wednesday afternoon necessarily expecting to talk directly about white supremacy culture right now. But certainly that's not me calling anyone in this particular group a white supremacist, as much as it's talking about this concept that normalizes whiteness, the thoughts, beliefs, and actions, as being superior to people of color, ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions, right? And so this is a norm that we have to struggle with within our country that justifies and binds together institutions, locking them into larger systems of power and control. And I think a good example of this that I would point people toward, if you think this is a reach, or you think this is not a real thing, I would point you to the Dahl test. So the Dahl test is essentially like a sociological experiment that was done in the 60s and then recreated some 40 years later, in which Black children were given two dolls, a white doll and a Black doll, and asked which one is the smart one, which one is the well-behaved one, which one is the good one, the nice one. And for all of those positive attributes, these Black children chose the white doll. When they were asked, which one is the bad one, or the, less intelligent one, they chose the Black doll. Not because anybody told them or put them up to saying such a thing, but because based on their observations, even at their young ages, for how they saw themselves and the folks in their community being treated by the various systems, the conditions that they live in, so on and so forth, and what they saw in terms of their white counterparts, they recognized that there was a huge difference, right? And so that's, an example, I think, of how well embedded into our culture this idea is, right? That there is a difference between, and one's better and one's worse, being white versus being a person of color, and subscribing to the cultures thereof, right? And so that's something that we have to wrestle with, that does inform the history of our systems, the way that they operate, and the impact that that has on communities of color. And it impacts the work that we have to do, right, in order to shift those cultures, in order to call out those practices, those policies, those behaviors that lend themselves to this type of, crucial impact. You see the fishbowl there. For the longer you swim in a culture, the more invisible it becomes, right? It's something that becomes very difficult to see, right? Because it's the way that we are socialized from day one, right? So it's our default, and it takes real work and processes to do the unpacking that gets us to a place where we see that we are normalizing, valuing, certain thoughts, certain ideas, certain concepts and practices over others, or valuing certain speakers and certain contributions to larger discussions that we need to have over, others, right? Based on, on some level, this white supremacy culture. So we talked about this a little bit before. I would point not to the definition, but more to the illustration here, because what it's trying to show you, right? If you can read that, it says, "What's the matter? It's the same distance," and it is, right? It's the same distance, but you see a white man on the left, you see a Black woman on the right, with a lot more obstacles in her way to get the same distance, and also with a weight on her ankle, right? So that's what structural racism can look like. Yeah, we all have to work for a living. Yes, we all have to, would like to be educated and so on and so forth, in order to travel the paths of our dreams. But some of us have very real barriers and obstacles in our way that impact us in ways that they do not impact everyone else. And a lot of that is based on race and what race means about access, right? And so we have to understand that, and we have to begin to acknowledge those things, but also to take a look at how we can go about troubleshooting these types of issues, responding directly again to those needs, right? So how do we remove these obstacles? How do we remove these barriers as opposed to refusing to acknowledge them if we want to seriously do equity work? And now moving on to mental models. So mental model is simply an explanation of thought process, right? How do we understand the world around us? What are our underlying assumptions, beliefs, and values that help us to process or at least influence and guide the way that we understand the world around us, the way that we respond, and how it connects to the current constructs that we have, right? So this is all sort of building on, this cultural normalization and socialization that we have. It creates for us a number of mental models, and I'll give you some example of what that looks like, so that we can unpack sort of how we go about really calling out and moving in a different way, right? A more intentional and equitable way to create workable and equitable solutions to the issues that so many of our systems face. So here's an example of what mental models can look like, right? The iceberg, right? And so this is here to show you that on the surface, right, there may be an event, right? And a lot of times when events occur, particularly incidents surrounding race, that's where we like to stop. Oh, this is an isolated incident. This doesn't happen often. It's that one person's issue or problem and should not reflect on the rest of us. And certainly, while we understand on some level folks reacting or responding that way, and certainly individuals, are responsible on some level for acts that are based in racism, it speaks to larger underlying issues that are beneath the surface, right? And so the analogy that we're using here is catching a cold, right? So the event above the surface is I've caught a cold, right? But I've caught a cold on some level more often than not because of patterns and trends, right, that have existed over time, right? I've been catching, here the example is I've been catching more colds when I've been sleeping less, right? I'm getting less sleep. I'm not taking care of myself. So I'm more susceptible to getting a cold. And that tells me something about how we got here. The underlying structure, right, influencing that pattern and trend that led to the event is the relationships between the parts. And here that is more stress at work, right, causing me to sleep less, not eating well, which also impacts sleep, difficulty accessing healthy food near home or work. So maybe there's some digestive issues that are keeping me awake. And the mental models, right, again, the underlying assumptions, beliefs, and values that keep these structures in place for me. Number one, career is the most important piece of my identity, right? So even if I'm not feeling great, even if I haven't had enough sleep, even if I'm not eating well, I have to show up to work consistently and not take, time off to take care of myself. Also, the healthy food is too expensive, right? So I will eat something, right? It may not be the healthiest thing or the best thing for me, which again goes on to create these sort of issues in my general health, as well as rest is for the unmotivated. I'll sleep when I die, right? But I won't sleep the requisite amount of time every day to keep myself healthy. So all of this is what's underlying that event, right? So if you think about events on a systemic level as opposed to an individual level, then you have to ask yourself, well, what are those mental models? What are the assumptions? What are the beliefs or values that hold a system, underlying structures, patterns, and trends in place to cause the event, right? And so rather than reacting to one event, what we need to be able to do is to anticipate events based on these patterns and trends, to redesign our underlying structures, right? And that means transforming the way that we think, transforming these assumptions, beliefs, and values in such a way that allows us to do all of these things listed here, such that these events are a lot less likely to continue, not because we're reacting to one, but because we've changed the underlying structures that lend themselves to this happening time and time again. All right, so now that we've done a little bit of level setting, we've shared some concepts and some terminology, we can get into sort of what structural well-being approach is. So this is a picture of James Bell. Like I said, he is retiring at the end of this year, but obviously as the founder and president, he's been very invaluable and influential to all of us, and we will hate to see him go, but appreciate the path that he has laid forward for all of us within the organization and within this work overall, right? And so I'll let you guys read this quote if you would like to. It's a lot of words that essentially mean what you see on the right side here, that justice reform must transcend justice, right? That this is, when we're talking about things that happen, particularly within justice systems, those things are impacted by every other system, right? From healthcare to education to housing, transit, workforce development, mental health, you name it, right? All of these things impact justice. And so it's bigger, it's a bigger responsibility than just the justice system and its actors alone can bear to try to have a true impact on these outcomes, right? In an equitable way, and actually to create a path forward that allows people to thrive regardless of their backgrounds. And regardless of race, and no longer allowing that to simply sort of pigeonhole people in a cycle of poverty or neglect that lends itself to people showing up in our systems time and time again. So when we talk about the structural well-being approach, right, it's essentially developed in response to these 4 persistent barriers that we've come up against as an organization when we're trying to do this work, right? The number one, and we call these the 4 conundrums, but the first conundrum goes back to something that we talked about before, right? This principle, right? This concept that justice is colorblind and race neutral, or should be colorblind and race neutral. And that may be, you know, again, something that's interesting for you guys to hear, but again, you can't do, first of all, you can't be racially equitable if you're not willing to talk about race, if you're not willing to see race and see, you know, the differences, the nuances, the dynamics and impacts that, you know, race and racial differences will undoubtedly bring up for the different communities represented within your county or state. But not only that, I mean, colorblind means you're not responding directly to the needs of individual groups or communities. It means you're taking a one-size-fits-all approach. I see that a lot in my work, and generally that leads to an outcome that is something like, hey, so our overall numbers in terms of, say, pretrial jail admissions are going down, but our disparities are going up, right? And another way to say that potentially is the things that we're putting in place work really well for white people who encounter our system. And the reason that is because you're not responding, again, directly to the needs of all of the groups who are involved in the system, right? So we can't create one thing that's supposed to land on everyone in the same way, recognizing that people are in different places with different sets of needs, we have to respond directly to the need. And so that's the first conundrum. The second is investments in communities that most populate the justice sector is outside the justice sector's purview. What that means is so much of what we come up against in terms of trying to shift the outcomes or impact outcomes among communities of color in representation within systems of incarceration or the like is poverty, right? Poverty as a result of, on some level, policies and practices that value white communities more than they value communities of color and the people of color within them. And that is not the justice system's job alone to deal with, right? We need various players, stakeholders, in a cross-sector sort of formation across the board, being willing and able to mobilize resources and funds to really respond to all of those very complex and nuanced historical and continuing sort of conditions, right, that communities of color have to struggle with right now. So it can't just be justice system. We talked about the various sectors that are so often, involved in or also reflected in what we see in the justice system, and we have to have all hands on deck across all of those sectors to really have an impact here. The third conundrum is that government is not structured to promote flexible cross-sector responses, right? So as much as we need that, and as much as it can't just be the justice system working to fix issues that range, across the board, we don't currently have many structures or processes in place that allow or promote those flexible cross-sector responses, right? People have different policies, different procedures, different handbooks or reporting structures or, authorizations to go through. And it makes it very difficult for different aspects or agencies or organizations within government to actually work together to share budgetary information or administrative oversight in a way that means that we can actually play as a team together to respond directly to the needs that folks may have in the system. And last, sort of along the lines of the third conundrum, very difficult for elected and appointed officials, right, to share power with each other, right, much like government and the various organizations and agencies within it, but also difficult for elected and appointeds to share power with communities most in need of human service interventions, right? It's very important for all of these things to happen, but the structures that we have now and the way that those structures have been built, the cultures that have risen out of those structures, and the mental models underlying all of that make it extremely difficult to actually achieve any of these, or to solve any of these particular conundrums or issues in such a way that leads us to transform our systems into something equitable and that works for everyone. Okay, so a little bit about harm reduction. It's usually facilitating community and system stakeholders through a data-driven process to create alternatives to especially secure detention, right? Whereas the structural well-being framework is meant to facilitate community and cross-sector stakeholders through a values-driven process using qualitative and quantitative data to deconstruct structural racism, reimagine the system, and develop community-centered responses structured to promote well-being. Another way of putting this is while data should still inform what we're doing within a structural well-being approach, we know that data alone won't get the job done because, we as an organization have spent the last 20 years showing people in various jurisdictions their data and the disparities thereof. And what we find is that people are more than happy to attempt at least to justify those numbers. So if we don't establish a set of values first for how we approach this work, what we all are willing to believe in, as well as creating some norms around how we're going to work together in spite of the inevitable conflicts that will arise, then we're not going to actually be able to do this deconstruction and transformation work. And thus, structural well-being, system of public policies, institutional and inclusive practices, cultural representations, and other norms to strengthen families, communities, and individual well-being for positive life outcomes. The way that we, another way that we say this is, how do we get all of our systems to mobilize to create opportunities for people to thrive? So I won't spend too much time on these next couple of slides, but essentially what we're trying to show with these is that structural well-being should include sort of all of the above, right? So from prevention, which I'm noticing that my border is it's falling a little short here. I don't think it does so on my personal PowerPoint, but it does in the slideshow. But prevention, which is more on the front end, trying to keep people from entering the system, and then harm reduction, right, which is trying to minimize the impact and the collateral consequences once people are, charged or convicted of offenses and the process for them of entering the system begins, right? These two sort of sectors, concepts, approaches usually are not interacting, engaging, coordinating, or talking to each other very much. So it's the same system. I mean, it's the same families, right? A family that you may be targeting for prevention efforts just based on risk factors that you're aware of, inevitably some of those folks may end up here, and we're not sharing information, right, about what we know about a family, what we know about needs within a community based on the prevention work that's being done and where it's falling short, as well as from the harm reduction standpoint, what do we know about the different things, programs, services, supports that might be needed in the prevention space to keep people from ever getting here. Structural well-being wants to sort of bring all of these things together, along with looking at, again, systemic transformation, right? That disruptive sort of high-level transformation to systems, not just prevention and harm reduction, but all of the other human services systems working together to say, how do we most flexibly and equitably respond to the needs of people in our communities in ways that are not necessarily the most punitive thing every time that there is, an incident, but how do we create the opportunities for folks, again, to stay out of these systems, to have the things that they need that will drive them away from ever showing up in the system to begin with. Right, so it takes both sides of the spectrum actually working together in conjunction with every other system that impacts lives and quality of life within a particular jurisdiction or community for this to work. Okay, so what do we know about well-being, or what do you need to thrive? I'm sure most of you have probably heard of social determinants of health. Similarly, we've come up with social determinants of justice. These are things that folks can readily identify as aspects of life that either contribute to or have an impact on the likelihood of a person entering a justice system at some point in their lives, right? Things like economic stability, education, healthy lifestyle, social and community supports, an actual supportive neighborhood with folks who want to see you succeed and want to help. These are all things, and there are a number of others. If I stop now and start asking people, I'm sure you guys could come up with, quite a few more social determinants of justice, things that will impact, whether or not a person is likely to enter the justice system, right? So these are the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. They're shaped by distribution of money, power, influence, and resources at every level, global, national, and local, right? And the way that they're designed right now, they perpetuate structural racism, right? Feeders of mass incarceration, devourers of opportunity for social, emotional, and familial well-being. That's what we are up against. And that's what the structural well-being approach was designed to respond directly to. So what does that approach look like? Here, I just pause usually to say, so we have, several sort of components to the approach. This is the way that they chose to visualize us. I probably would not have chosen 6 raindrops. Probably would have chosen something more like rungs on a ladder, or something that's just a little bit more sort of visually stimulating. But essentially, what we're trying to do with each of these, right, is, so one, establish a cross-systems collaborative. You'll see cross-system and cross-sector a lot, because we can't tell you enough that, again, with the social determinants of justice being what they are, you can't just have a justice system. You've got to have so many other stakeholders and agencies and organizations represented and able to work together to build something new. There also has to be an awareness of structural racism and the history of structural racism and how that impacts life today, which is what sessions 2 and 3 are going to be about. I will take this opportunity to tell you all that the way that we like to do that awareness of structural racism is we sort of start looking at the history from a national perspective. But at some point, probably in session 3 in particular, we're going to want to hear from you all about what the history in Pima County has been. Because it's important not just to understand it on a national level, but also to understand locally what the impacts are, and not to simply sort of look at a national historical lens and say, yeah, that's not us, but yeah, I guess, bad things happened elsewhere, but to own that there are some things that happened in any jurisdiction, in any particular locale, anywhere in this country, that contribute to inequity and disparity along racial and ethnic lines even today. And then anchoring the work, right? So again, building those values and those working agreements, right? And living up to them in terms of how we engage each other as, the chief of police or chief judge or, educator, who are all coming together to say, how do we work together to create something new? We all have to be equal. And interpersonally, right, we all have to be equal in terms of how we value each other's voices. Not only that, but we also need community, right? And we have to center community in this work. So obviously we need all of these various system stakeholders, but you have to center folks who've been impacted, folks who advocate on behalf of those who've been impacted, folks who serve people who have been impacted, or serve the community at large, to understand what the community needs are, how to meet the community where they are in terms of design, and how to have community share power in terms of what is built, what's developed, to ensure that it actually works and responds directly to the people who know what they need in order to solve some of these issues and to move forward equitably. Next, again, data is extremely important. It can't, it should inform what we do. It can't drive it, right? We got to have values to drive the approach, but data becomes extremely important. And again, this is at a cross-sector level, right? What are the points of intersection between agencies, systems, organizations, groups within your county, and how do those points of intersection give us insight as to what's needed, right? And how do they give us insight as to how to build or propose a way forward? And important as well, right, is, so when we talk about data, and you saw this earlier, we're talking quantitative and qualitative, right? So it's not just about numbers. Numbers are extremely important, but it's also about qualitative data collection, such as surveys and focus groups and one-to-one interviews. And even if those things are anonymous, and they probably should be if you want candor, being able to quantify that as well, right? This many respondents indicated that this particular issue is something that they would like to see addressed or prioritized, so on and so forth, right? That gives you great insight as to how to move forward with community, sharing power and centering community in a way that's going to lead you to, rather than saying, oh, disparities are going up, but the overall numbers are going down. Now we're responding to needs in such a way that we're closer toward creating that curb cut effect, that transformational change, which is the last rung, right? Wanting to see that power sharing again between community and systems, wanting to see community have some say, some level of input, some level of access to what gets funded, right? That's going to be so important, because at some point, budgetary constraints and concerns and impacts come up. What are we building? What are we funding to respond to those needs? And what does community have to say about that? How is community being heard in that regard as well? And radical imagination, right? So we do, sometimes we do exercises where we have people think about what they would build or what they would create to serve their communities. Of money was no object, and something that we might talk about at some later point within this series, or at some other point in the future. But it always strikes me how much people are still very much within a box, right, of certain norms, and again, certain mental models about what they can do, what they can't do, what's needed and what isn't. And so you have to have radical imagination, and community, I think, can be a big help with this, because they're less inclined toward the status quo, the policies, the procedures, the whatever, that keep people limited in the way that they think, and are more willing to say, well, why don't you try X, Y, and Z? Or what if we didn't have to concern ourselves with these sort of futile limitations that we have. So that, in a nutshell, is the overall approach, right? None of these things being, easily or quickly done, but all of these things being necessary to get to cross-sector transformational change. And I think what comes next is just sort of breaking down some of these a little bit more in terms of what they look like, right? So cross-systems collective has to have inquiry and vision, the capacity for equity reform, which means you have to structure it in such a way that these folks can actually influence policy and practice changes, or influence systemic level change. Also, composition of leadership can't just be representatives from whatever agency. At some point, you need the folks who actually make decisions to be assembled to do this work. Going from community engagement to centering the work and the various political considerations that you all will know way better than I would in your jurisdiction. And so part of what we do, or one of the tools that we use, are, or is this exercise around stages of structural racism awareness, right? This changes for folks depending on the scenario, that we use. right? From completely unaware to acknowledges racism, denies privilege. Yeah, racism exists, but not for me, or not, in any way that I'm contributing to actually seeing structural inequity, connecting the dots, ultimately being the change and making the change. And depending on, again, what the scenario is and what your lens is, I don't think anyone is on any one particular space here all of the time, right? We all have blind spots. And so a scenario may be presented that brings up a blind spot, and we may be more likely to end up here when we really want to be down here. And so just getting people to sort of self-identify, and then to unpack and to talk about where those blind spots are, what it means to really become aware of and see structural inequity, the connection between inequity and privilege, and how you get to actually advocating for equity in a meaningful way. Last but not least, in terms of anchoring the work, I think one of the things that we have to focus on with groups like this is that for the approaches that we're talking about, right? You're a person in a role within a system. And those three sort of rungs may be in conflict, and often are going to be in conflict with each other at various points, right? There may be impacts that your system may be having that you're not particularly okay with or comfortable with, but because of your role or what you feel the limitations of your role are, you have to try to figure out what you can navigate, what you can manage, how you can, again, be a part of that change. And those things, your system or your role may be very different than how you personally feel. And so we have to have the space, right, to be able to talk about and explore that level of conflict, and to figure out a way forward that's going to make a difference for everyone in an equitable way. So this is just a visual of what centering community looks like. When we talk about community, I think it's important to kind of go through these, because when we talk about community, anybody technically who lives in a particular area could consider themselves community. When we're talking about it, we mean folks who have been directly impacted. We mean folks who engage on behalf of those who have been directly impacted. We talk about service providers, as well as the funders and stakeholders within a community, right? And it's important to share power and decision-making, which includes transparency, which even includes public data sharing, which a lot of times in a lot of jurisdictions can be an issue. And ultimately, that all stems from a belief that people who are closest to the issue have the solution, and that they are experts in their own way. They're experts who deserve to be valued, just like our well-educated and sort of traditionally lauded subject matter experts within the field. So this is just an example of what a participatory budget could look like. I actually like this slide better. I think it just kind of gives a clearer example of what we're talking about. So cross-sector transformational change, and in particular, a participatory budget toward that end could look something like this, right? With community members having some level of direct say about projects that are meant to have the desired impact on communities who need it, right? And then being able to brainstorm what those proposals look like, vote on the ones that they want to see funded and that they think are the best suited for inaction, and then seeing those projects get funded and begin to operate, and seeing the impact on communities, as well as the community response, right, as those programs get launched. So that's just a sort of brief overview of what structural well-being is. The roadmap we like to use just as a visual, right? So starting at awareness of structural racism, starting with establishing cross-sector collaboratives, and then going along this road, right? From historical competency to building trust among the various agencies and sectors represented, the power sharing and centering community, lending itself to the cross-sector data, the radical imagination, and the necessary legislative changes, which are obviously a longer term undertaking that ultimately lead to cross-sector transformational change, right? That's what structural well-being is all about. And there's a reason that this is an intro. Obviously, it's a very long and arduous process, but we believe that in response to structural racism, an approach like this is what's going to be necessary to really begin to create those opportunities for every person, regardless of their race, regardless of their income levels, so on and so forth, to be treated in a way, or at least given an opportunity, right, by all of these systems to thrive. And I think that's what we all want. I think that's what all of our systems at their core are designed for. But we have to recognize that that's going to cause for, or it's going to call for some cultural shift, and it's going to call for some disruption to the ways that we do things now, understanding where some of our thinking, some of our structures have come from, and rebuilding, restructuring, reimagining to move forward in a bold way that means and makes a huge difference on communities of color and other various communities that have been marginalized by human services systems, by carceral systems, so on and so forth. So I will stop my screen share right there and ask if there are any questions or any comments at this time. I think that concludes at least the presentation. And I want to thank you all for listening. No one seemed to jump in with any questions, and I didn't see any arising out of the chat, but I'm certain that there are some things to discuss. So definitely want to open the floor now and see if anybody had anything to add.
Again, if anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand and we can call you by name, or if you just want to unmute yourself, even if you just want to give some feedback on some of the points of the presentation that really jumped out to you or really spoke to you, or want to expound on what you felt around that, please don't hesitate.
Have any examples of groups that have implemented the roadmap successfully? So I think there are two learning communities, as we call them, that are in the process right now. So I can't say that they're at the end of the roadmap, but they have taken some strides, particularly I think in, I'm forgetting the county names because I'm not actively working with them. Our president, James Bell, has been, I think, on the ground working with these two groups. I know one of them is in Toledo, Ohio. I think the other one is in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but there have been some, particularly in Minnesota, I think, not just in response to the work that the organization has done with them, but also in response to things that have happened, right? Incidents and events that have occurred, within recent years in Minnesota. There have been some changes, that I think are a direct reflection of the structural well-being work in terms of policy changes specifically made by the DA's office, in terms of which offenses to charge for and which ones to simply decide that are not the best use of public resources and funds in terms of improving community safety. So I think those are some examples that we've seen. I think in Lucas County in Ohio, I am a lot less connected to that work. So for them, what I know is that this is very much a process that involves so many folks on the ground that is very well underway, but I don't have in my mind like any huge examples of where they've, what the end result has been for them yet. I think those conversations and those activities are still ongoing for them, and I'll be looking forward to getting some examples that I would be happy to share with you at a later date for sure. Have you ever dealt with organizations, people who are resistant to change all the time, and acknowledging structural racism, but who changed their mind after further discussion? Did anything in particular cause a light bulb moment that led to a change in thinking? So yes, I have in certain ways, and I think I can't really point to specific things, right, that I need to say that are going to do that. I think what you want to do is you want to say it and display it, right, or show it, prove it as many times as you can in as many ways as are possible, which is why, again, it's important for me to say to you all, yeah, we're going to talk about history, next week from a national lens, and probably won't finish the whole like national, sort of lens next week. That's why we have 2 sessions for it. But part of what we want to do in session 3 is hear from you guys about what's happened where you are, because I could say to a person, well, these things happened in these, random areas across the country. And you could say that has nothing to do with me. And I don't, that sucks for those folks, but why are you telling me? And if a person says, well, these things happen right here in our county, and this is how they impacted my family, or this is how they impacted the family down the street, that could have more of an impact. And also just certain types of stories coming from certain people, right? So I think the repetition is huge, right? It takes a lot of repetition for people to get their minds around it. I think empathy is huge, and empathy is hard because essentially, right, your question is talking about people who maybe aren't showing much empathy, right? But empathy just in terms of understanding where their perspective is and what's making them tick, and then trying to use that to say, to make your statement. So for me recently, in another site, I just recognized that part of the issue that I was having getting through was that, there was a state's attorney who I think was hearing what I was saying as, we want you to do specific things for your Black population and for your Latinx population that you don't do for anyone else. And I'm never saying that. What I'm saying is, you need to do things that respond directly to your, in this particular jurisdiction, your Black and your Latinx population, because they are overrepresented in your system. And the things that you create or develop to respond directly to what they need are going to be applied across the board to everyone, right? It's just going to change ultimately the way that your system operates. And so it was literally just picking up on what was being said, recognizing the perspective that it was coming from, and then course correcting for this person, to kind of have a light bulb moment. So I think that's generally what it takes, that and a bunch of repetition and as much variation as you can muster, so that people hear different things, and hopefully one of those things being repeated with respect to their perspective, their lens, their understanding, making a difference.
If I can piggyback on that, Mr. James, as well, I think having a common vocabulary and a common language to discuss and to express the messages or the intention and directions we're working with, more often than not, I found in my experience in dealing with folks that just their simple definition of a specific word like equity or equality, once you come to a common language of this is the definition we're going to work from and the definition we're going to use and what we're doing, then it kind of changes their perspective, because they go, wow, I never, I may not have even looked at it that way, or I thought about it totally different. And when I apply this definition to what I'm doing and the work I'm doing and the way I'm addressing it, it totally changes things. So being able to establish that common vocabulary, that common language, that common definition moving forward to establish stuff, I think for me has opened doors and allows people to be more open to dealing with things and looking at things from different perspectives.
Absolutely. Have you seen misinformation to be a significant contributor of resistance to change? Have you come up with any specific strategies to combat misinformation? Yes, so I think definitely misinformation is a significant contributor. And I think so. One of the strategies definitely is that transparency, right? So rather than folks needing to look up certain, you know, certain thing or relying on, people who are not necessarily accurate or don't even have access to the type of data that they would need to make certain assertions, right? Actually getting the information out in terms of what the data actually shows, what the stories actually are. I think also one of the things, that I think will help, and something that I've raised before, is so when we talk about sort of cross-sector transformational change and cross-sector collaborative spaces and all of this sort of stuff, yeah, we think a lot about human services, systems and agencies and organizations, but I don't know that we think maybe enough about media. So if you have local journalists who can kind of go overboard with the story of, hey, this bad thing happened and it happened after this person got released on bond because they've done these bond reform things and everybody's going to be in trouble soon, like run to your homes and lock your doors. You might need those folks to actually get involved in what the conversation actually is and why you're doing what you're doing, in a way that allows them to sort of support that work, right? So I think that is missing, right? Is that direct connection to people who do this sort of work, at least people who care about the truth, having direct access to ask questions, answer, or have their questions answered, as well as having direct access to information, rather than a lot of innuendo, speculation, and the like. Now I know that sensationalism kind of drives clicks and eyes and so on and so forth. And so cynically, we may think that, a lot of folks, I think particularly in national media, are less likely to even want to engage in this way. But I think if you have local sort of trusted or trustworthy journalists and other media personalities who you could invite in to say, like, this is the impact that our system has, and this is what we want to change, and this is why we're doing this work. And, while it may not be perfect, or our responses to it may not always be perfect, the intent behind it is to do X, Y, and Z. Then you can help to, I don't even want to say shape or control the narrative, but you can help to make sure that what's being put out, particularly to local audiences, is accurate.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? Okay. I kind of like what you were talking about around the social media piece. Unfortunately, if I feel like in our society today, the tolerance of individual thought or individual opinion or of individual questions can be shunned upon by might makes right because you're not part of the majority, or you don't think like the majority, or that majority won't share the power to allow individuals to ask questions or broach other subjects or different perspectives, that it often quails or stops creative thought, ingenuity, or other ways or other forms to think out of the box to address situations or systems. So I think it's really, really imperative, like you said, to just be open-minded, look for the truth, be able to listen, and just be able to respond appropriately and not judge and be intolerant.
Yep. And I think I would just add, sort of the way that we're wired, we respond to stories. We respond to them on, a visceral level, particularly when they are anomalous or when they're individually based, right? So if people are having issues with certain steps that are being taken, and look at how many people are being maybe released, or how many people are getting a diversion as opposed to being taken into custody, and so on and so forth. I think what you have to do is be able to tell the story of the people that this is helping, right? Like, here's this person who didn't pay this fine, or whatever the case is, and they had the prospect of having their lives completely upended, but because of this change, right, they're able to move forward and move on. I just think that information has to get out, and people have to understand it. And so part of it is being able to share data transparently with community, and also, again, the importance of story, right? So more than just charts and graphs and numbers that people soon forget, but what are the stories, and who are the people who have been impacted in a positive way, and even some of the people who, before some of these things were implemented, were impacted in negative ways. And posing the question, I think, publicly, as to whether or not people are actually okay with that.
We have a comment that says, I can't emphasize that storytelling element enough, making a mental note to explore how we can really dial into that element. True. That lived experience.
Yeah, and that's where you start, because I think for folks who have been through it, or for folks whose family members have been impacted by these systems, I promise you, if you give them a place to express themselves, and you tell them that you want to hear from them, they have the content, and they will. If you create a base level of trust or trustworthiness, they'll give it to you. They want to be heard, and they deserve to be heard on these things, and to have their stories, their experiences be a part of designing what comes next.
That was Kate using Myra's link to make that comment. All right, Kate. We're looking at 3:30 on the dot. I want to be respectful of people's time, and I know people might have other things scheduled and might have to transition to their next meeting. Mr. James, did you have any final comments?
I will just thank you all for coming. I will probably send a PDF to Doyle of the slides that we used today. If you're looking at your screen and you're saying, who is this Sandra Sosa person who has the same logo that we've seen all this time? I wasn't going to put you on the spot, Sandra, and ask you to turn on your screen, but thank you. Sandra is my colleague, and she's going to be, I think, in all of the other sessions with me as we go through history and then centering community at the end. So she'll be co-facilitating, and I thank her for joining when she could. Thank you all for joining this call as well. Certainly, if there are any questions, I can drop my email in the chat here. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out in between now and the next session, or at any point going forward.
Okay. And guys, please, we ask you to continue to participate. This is going to be every Wednesday moving forward for the next 3 following Wednesdays, to continue the process and to build upon each session. So please come back, share with some of your counterparts and your other individuals that you may work with, tell them they need to come to the table to get this training, to be part of this seminar. We really want to thank you for your time. We want to thank you for your energy, and hopefully we'll look forward to seeing you guys next week. Thank you guys for attending, and we'll talk to you later. Thank you, Mr. James, for taking us through this, and we will appreciate it and look forward to it next week.
Thank you.